When the silence broke, the evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy in the air, as if everyone is waiting for something to happen. Joe Rogan sat in the corner of a dimly lit studio, his hands folded, his thoughts heavier than his voice had been all day. People knew Joe as someone who spoke without fear, a man who asked questions others avoided. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't sure if his words would be enough. The cameras had not yet started rolling, and the studio lights flickered, like they were nervous too. The silence was broken only when the door opened slowly, and Keanu Reeves walked in with that calm energy he carried everywhere, an energy that made people pause before speaking. Keanu's steps were soft, almost unnoticeable, but the way he carried himself filled the room. His eyes were steady, kind, but serious, as if he had already lived through the conversation that was about to begin. Joe looked up, and in that moment there was no noise from the outside world, no chatter, no audience, just two men who were about to face something much bigger than themselves. Joe leaned forward, his voice low. "Keanu, everything is changing, and people are not ready for it." He said it with a kind of worry that showed even a strong man like him could feel fear. Keanu didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed his hands on the table like he was grounding himself. His silence was not empty. It was filled with patience, respect, and the weight of what was coming. The hook came quickly when Keanu finally spoke. His words were simple, but they cut through the silence like a blade. "Joe, change is not the enemy. Fear is. People can handle the truth, but they cannot handle being left in the dark." Joe felt those words press against his chest because he knew they were not just about the world outside, they were about him too. He had been holding back, hiding questions he was too afraid to ask, worried about what the answers would mean for everyone watching. Keanu's calmness felt like a mirror, showing Joe his own hesitation. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He realized this conversation wasn't just about ideas or opinions. It was about courage, about being human enough to admit weakness and still move forward. As the two men sat there, the tension in the room grew stronger, but it wasn't the kind of tension that breaks. It was the kind that builds. Joe's mind raced with memories of all the times he had been mocked for saying what he truly believed. All the moments when the world seemed ready to silence voices like his. And yet, sitting across from him was Keanu, a man who had faced more pain than most could imagine, but still carried himself with humility and kindness. It was like Joe was looking at a blueprint for resilience. He wondered how a man who had lost so much could still be so calm, so respectful, and so ready to stand beside someone else. Keanu didn't need to say much. His presence was the lesson. Then came the first twist. Just as Joe felt ready to open up, the door to the studio creaked again. A producer rushed in, his face pale, his voice trembling. "Something has happened," he whispered. "Outside, people are gathering. They are waiting for you two. They think you have answers." Joe's heart pounded. He wasn't ready. He had been preparing for a simple conversation, not for a crowd that wanted hope, not for people who were desperate to hear words that might change their lives. He looked at Keanu, searching for a reaction, but Keanu only nodded slowly, his calm eyes shining like he had been expecting this all along. "Then we must speak," he said softly. And those 4 words carried more power than any speech Joe had ever heard. The suspense thickened. Joe felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What if he said the wrong thing? What if he disappointed them all? What if this was the moment that defined him and he failed? His hands shook, but Keanu placed his hand lightly on Joe's arm, steadying him without force. "You don't have to be perfect," Keanu said. "You just have to be honest. People respect honesty more than answers." Joe swallowed hard. His whole life he had been the one asking questions, but now he realized he had to give something more. His own truth, his own heart, his own humanity. And that was terrifying. But sitting beside him, Keanu's presence made it seem possible, as they stood together. The noise outside grew louder, the crowd's voices blending into a hum of expectation. Joe took a deep breath, his chest heavy. But he didn't feel alone anymore. He wasn't just Joe Rogan, the man who asked hard questions. He was Joe Rogan standing beside Keanu Reeves, and together, they carried a strength neither could have, carried alone. The stage was no longer just a place for words. It had become a place for courage, humility, and truth. In that moment, everything began to change. And both men knew deep inside that this was only the beginning of a story that would test their limits and reveal who they truly were. The crowd outside, the door of the studio rattled again as the voices outside grew louder, filling the air with a restless energy. Joe Rogan could hear them clearly now. People chanting, people calling his name, and even more, people calling for answers. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something that sounded like desperation. He had never felt such pressure before. The studio, which once felt like a safe place for open conversations, now felt like a stage that had no walls. Every word he spoke tonight would travel far beyond the microphones. The crowd was proof that people were no longer satisfied with silence. Joe's heart raced. He looked at Keanu Reeves, hoping to borrow from his calmness again. Keanu, as always, sat still, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing slow. It was almost like he had been waiting for this exact moment his whole life. "Listen to them," Keanu said softly, his voice carrying both kindness and weight. "They are not calling for me. They are calling for you. You have touched something in them, Joe, and now they are here to remind you of it." Those words shook Joe more than the noise outside. He had always thought of himself as someone who challenged ideas, not someone who led people. But Keanu's words made it clear. This wasn't just about an interview anymore. It was about standing up for something real. The producer hesitated, pacing nervously near the door. "We can cancel this," he said quickly. "We can send them away. Say the show is postponed." His voice carried the fear Joe himself felt. But before Joe could even think of agreeing, Keanu turned his head slowly, his eyes piercing in their calmness. "If you send them away now, they will lose more than a show. They will lose faith. And once faith is gone, it never comes back." Joe knew Keanu was right. Deep inside, he felt a fire burning, the same fire that had once pushed him to speak when no one else dared. But tonight, that fire came with a cost, because now he had to speak not just for himself, but for everyone waiting outside. Joe stood up, his knees unsteady. He remembered moments from his past, nights when he had spoken boldly, but later faced criticism, laughter, and hate. Those scars were still fresh. Every hateful comment, every doubt whispered into his ear came back like shadows. For a second, he almost sat down again. But then Keanu rose beside him. The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, and that image alone gave Joe strength. Keanu didn't push him forward. He didn't demand courage. He simply stood there, reminding Joe that he wasn't alone. That silent reminder carried more power than 1,000 speeches. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed outside. Someone had slammed on the studio door, and the sound made everyone in the room freeze. Joe's pulse spiked, and for a second, fear drowned him. What if this crowd was not filled with hope but anger? What if they were here not to listen but to demand? Before panic could take over, Keanu spoke again. "Fear is loud, but truth is louder. Let's show them the difference." His calm tone steadied Joe like a hand holding back a storm. Joe realized the moment was here. He could not run. He could not hide. Everything would change tonight, whether he was ready or not. They pushed the door open together. The bright light from outside poured in, and for the first time Joe saw the faces of the crowd. They were not angry. They were tired, worried, and hungry for words that could give them strength. There were old faces, young faces, men, women, strangers who somehow felt like family in their pain. Joe's breath caught in his throat. These were not enemies. These were people who believed he had something to offer. And Keanu was right there beside him, silent but powerful, ready to share the weight. Joe stepped forward, the crowd quieting almost instantly. He felt his voice tremble as he spoke. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his words slow, careful. "But I will not stay silent when silence hurts more than truth." For a moment the crowd stayed still, as if holding its breath. Then a single clap rose from the back, followed by another and then more, until the sound grew into something stronger than the earlier chants. Joe felt tears sting his eyes, because in that applause he didn't hear pressure, he heard trust. And trust, he realized, was the heaviest gift anyone could give. Keanu placed a gentle hand on Joe's shoulder, his quiet voice guiding him further. "Now that you have spoken, the real journey begins. Because every truth you share will test you, and every test will show who you really are." Joe nodded slowly. He didn't feel completely ready, but he felt something even more important. He felt willing, and that willingness was enough to take the next step. Together, Joe and Keanu faced the crowd, not as a speaker and a guest, but as two men willing to walk through uncertainty with honesty, respect, and courage. The first question, the night air, wrapped around them as Joe Rogan and Keanu Reeves faced the crowd. The applause faded into a heavy silence, the kind of silence that waits for something important. Joe could feel hundreds of eyes fixed on him, eyes filled with hope, with doubt, with desperation. He could almost hear their unspoken questions, pressing into him, weighing him down. His throat felt dry, and for a moment he thought his voice might fail him. But then he remembered Keanu's words, that honesty mattered more than perfection. That thought steadied him, even as his heart raced like a drum in his chest. From the center of the crowd, a young man stepped forward. His clothes were worn, his face pale, but his eyes carried a fire that demanded attention. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He simply spoke, and his voice cut through the night like a blade. "Joe," he said, "what do we do when everything we believed in begins to fall apart? When the people we trusted fail us? How do we keep going?" The question was raw, heavy, and filled with pain. Joe felt it sink deep into his chest, because it wasn't just a question. It was the very weight of the moment. This man wasn't asking for ideas. He was asking for strength, for a reason not to give up. Joe froze. All his years of conversations, debates, and interviews hadn't prepared him for this. He wasn't speaking to a guest or an audience anymore. He was speaking to people who were living their struggles, people who weren't looking for entertainment, but for something real to hold on to. His mind went blank for a heartbeat, fear whispering that he had nothing to offer. But before the silence grew too long, Keanu stepped closer. He didn't answer for Joe. Instead, he placed a hand on Joe's back as if to push him forward without force. "Speak," Keanu whispered. "Speak from where it hurts. That's where the truth lives." Joe inhaled slowly. His voice trembled when he began, but he didn't stop. "I know what it feels like to lose trust," he said, his words low but clear. "I know what it feels like to think everything is falling apart. I have been there too. And what I learned is this: you don't keep going because the world is easy. You keep going because there are people who still need you to. Even when you feel weak, even when you feel broken, you can be the reason someone else keeps standing. That is how you move forward." The words surprised him as they left his mouth, because he wasn't sure he had believed them until now. But as the crowd listened, he felt something shift. They weren't looking for a perfect answer. They were looking for honesty, and he had given them that. The young man's eyes softened, his shoulders dropping as if a heavy weight had been lifted. He nodded slowly, and though he said nothing more, the way he looked at Joe said enough. Joe felt his chest tighten with emotion. He realized he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had felt broken, for everyone who had once questioned if they could keep going. And in giving that answer, Joe felt a small piece of his own fear dissolve. The power of honesty was becoming real. But then, another voice rose from the crowd, sharper, colder. A man in a dark jacket pushed forward, his face twisted with doubt. "Words are easy," he said, his tone almost mocking. "You sit here and talk about honesty. But what about action? What have you really done, Joe? What makes you worth listening to?" The question was like a blade, cutting through the fragile trust that had begun to grow. Joe felt his stomach twist. He had expected doubt, but not so soon, not so directly. The crowd murmured, some nodding, some frowning, the air thickening with tension again. Joe opened his mouth, but no words came. His fear threatened to choke him. This was the moment he dreaded most, that someone would tear away the fragile hope he was building, that his voice would crumble under doubt. But before he could fall into silence, Keanu stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but it carried a strength that silenced the crowd instantly. "You ask what makes him worth listening to," Keanu said. "The answer is simple. He is here. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Courage is not about having all the answers. Courage is about showing up when it would be easier to stay silent. That is why he is worth listening to." The crowd quieted again, their eyes shifting from doubt to reflection. Joe turned to Keanu, gratitude flooding his chest. In that moment, he realized something important. He was not carrying this weight alone. The tension broke slightly, but Joe knew this was only the beginning. There would be more questions, more doubts, more challenges waiting to test him. And, yet for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face them. Because beside him stood Keanu Reeves, a man whose calmness was stronger than any storm. Joe understood that this night wasn't about proving himself perfect. It was about proving that even in imperfection, there was strength, respect, and the power to keep going. The breaking point, the night deepened, and the crowd outside the studio grew larger. What had started as a gathering of curious listeners was now a sea of faces lit by the soft glow of streetlights and phone screens. The atmosphere was heavy with both hope and doubt, a strange mix that felt like it could tip either way. Joe Rogan stood still, his heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. He had spoken honestly, but he knew the questions would only grow harder. Every word from here on carried the risk of lifting people higher or letting them fall deeper. The pressure was unlike anything he had ever felt. A woman stepped forward this time. Her voice was strong, but behind it was a sadness that could not be hidden. "My family has been struggling," she said, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "We lost everything last year. No one listens. No one helps. How do we hold on when there is nothing left?" The crowd grew silent again, their focus drawn to her pain. Joe's chest tightened. Her question was not about theory, not about politics, not about philosophy. It was about survival. He felt the weight of her words pull him down, and for a moment he wondered if he had anything meaningful to offer her. He hesitated, and in that hesitation came a rush of old memories, times when he himself had felt lost, when nothing seemed certain, when the future felt like a wall too high to climb. He wanted to tell her something that mattered, but doubt clouded his mind. What if his words sounded empty? What if they gave her false hope? Joe's silence stretched long enough that the woman's eyes flickered with disappointment. The crowd began to murmur again, the fragile trust they had placed in him beginning to tremble. Joe felt the breaking point approaching, and his hands shook as fear gripped him tightly. Keanu, who had been standing quietly at his side, stepped closer. His voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of lived pain. "I know what it feels like to lose everything," Keanu said softly. "I have been there. I lost the people I loved most, and for a long time, I felt like life had taken everything from me. But what I learned is this: loss does not take away your worth. Pain does. Not erase your strength. Sometimes the only thing we can do is take one step, even if it feels too small to matter. That step is what keeps hope alive." His words were not rehearsed, not polished. They were raw, filled with truth, and the silence that followed was not heavy anymore. It was tender, like the sound of hearts quietly breaking and mending all at once. Joe felt his throat tighten as he listened. He realized that Keanu had just shown him the path. The answer wasn't about solving every problem. It was about standing with people in their pain, showing them they were not alone. Joe gathered his courage and spoke again. "Your struggle matters," he said to the woman, his voice steady now. "You matter. Even when it feels like no one sees you, your fight still has meaning. And sometimes, the smallest act of holding on inspires someone else to do the same. We hold on together because none of us can carry this weight alone." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly, as if those words had given her a thread to cling to. The crowd exhaled, their murmurs replaced by a quiet respect. But just as Joe felt the trust returning, a sharp shout cut through the air. A man near the edge of the crowd raised his voice, his tone filled with anger. "You speak of hope," he yelled, "but hope doesn't pay bills. It doesn't fix the broken world. Are you just here to talk and make people feel better, or will you do something real?" The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between the comfort of Joe's words and the sting of the man's challenge. Joe's chest tightened again. The anger in that voice was not just his. It echoed the doubts of many others. He could feel the balance tipping once more, and the storm inside him threatened to return. Keanu turned to Joe, his calm gaze grounding. Him again. "This is the storm we must face," Keanu said softly. "Not every heart will be comforted, and not every voice will trust us. But courage is not about pleasing everyone. Courage is about standing even when you are questioned." Joe looked back at the crowd, the faces lit with both expectation and doubt. He felt fear, but he also felt something stronger rising within him. For the first time, he understood that tonight was not about winning over everyone. It was about proving that even in conflict, he would not walk away. The breaking point had come, and Joe knew the next words he spoke would define everything that followed. Words into action. The man's question lingered in the night air like a blade that refused to be put away. "Are you just here to talk, or will you do something real?" His voice carried the weight of every disappointment, every broken promise people had endured. Joe Rogan felt his chest tighten because deep inside he knew this was the hardest challenge yet. Words could comfort, but words alone could also feel empty. The crowd's silence was dangerous. It meant they were waiting for proof. Their trust was fragile, and this moment could shatter it completely. Joe looked around and saw not just faces, but lives hanging on the edge of his response. His mind raced. He thought about all the conversations he had hosted, all the voices he had given space to. Was that enough? Was he just a man with a microphone? Or could he be something more? Doubt flooded in quickly, whispering that he wasn't built for this kind of leadership. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a politician, he wasn't a savior. But then he turned his eyes to Keanu Reeves. Keanu wasn't speaking yet, but his quiet presence told Joe everything. Being a hero wasn't about having titles. It was about choosing to stand when it mattered most. Joe inhaled deeply, his lungs heavy with fear and determination, and he took a step forward. "You're right," Joe said, his voice steady but raw. "Hope doesn't pay bills. Hope doesn't fix broken systems. But hope is where action begins, because without hope, we stop trying. I cannot fix everything tonight, but I can promise this. I will not just sit in a room and talk while people outside struggle. Starting now, every voice here matters. Every story matters. And together we will build something real. Not just words, but steps. Small steps one after another until they lead to change." His words shook as he spoke them, but they carried a truth that could not be denied. Joe wasn't offering perfection. He was offering effort. And sometimes, effort was enough to ignite a spark. The crowd shifted, their silence softening. Some nodded, others crossed their arms, still guarded. But there was a noticeable change. They weren't looking at Joe as just a man on a stage anymore. They were looking at him as someone willing to share their burden. Yet doubt still lingered. The man who had shouted earlier narrowed his eyes, testing Joe's resolve. "Words again," he said bitterly. "What step will you take right now? Prove it." His demand was sharp, echoing like thunder. Joe froze for a second, his heart pounding. He had promised action, and now the challenge was immediate. He couldn't escape it. Keanu stepped forward this time. His calm voice broke the tension. "Sometimes the first step is not grand, but it must be real. The question is not what the world will give you, but what you will give to the world. Joe has promised honesty. Let that honesty begin tonight." He turned his gaze toward Joe, not with pressure, but with trust. Joe felt the weight of those words press against his chest. He realized he couldn't hide behind future promises. He had to show something here and now. But what could he give in this very moment that was real enough to prove his words? His mind turned quickly. Then it struck him. The very platform he had built, the microphone he had used for years, could now become a tool for more than conversation. "Tonight," Joe said, his voice rising, "I will open my platform for you. Not just for famous names, not just for experts, but for people like you standing here. Your stories deserve to be heard. And starting now, I will make sure they are. Every week, I will bring voices from outside these walls to speak, to be seen, to be respected. That is my first step." The words carried risk, but they carried power too. Because Joe knew this wasn't just a promise. It was a commitment that would force him to act. The crowd reacted slowly. Some clapped, some looked at each other with surprise, some still hesitated. But the shift was clear. The man in the dark, jacket lowered his arms, his expression no longer angry but thoughtful. The woman who had spoken earlier wiped her tears, her face softening with a fragile smile. For the first time, the crowd wasn't only listening, they were believing. Joe felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, but he knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a heavier journey, one where every step would be tested. Keanu placed a steady hand on Joe's shoulder again, his voice soft but powerful. "You see, Joe," he said, "truth alone can open hearts, but action keeps them open. Tonight you have chosen action. Remember this feeling. Because the road ahead will not grow easier, it will grow harder. But the harder it gets, the more it matters that we stand." Joe nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He felt the weight of the crowd's eyes, but for the first time, he didn't feel crushed by it. He felt carried by it, as if their trust and their doubt together were lifting him into something he had never been before. The storm had not passed. It had only shifted. But Joe Rogan knew one thing with certainty. This was the night when words turned into action, and that choice would change everything that followed. The test of trust. The night stretched on, and though the crowd's energy had softened after Joe Rogan's promise, the tension still hung in the air like a storm that refused to pass. People whispered to each other, some hopeful, others doubtful. Joe could feel it in their eyes. They believed, but belief alone was fragile. It could shatter with one wrong step. He had given his word, but now the question remained. Would he keep it? Trust was not built by speaking once. It was built by standing firm when the world tried to pull you down. Joe knew that the real test was still waiting for him. A man in his late 40s stepped forward. His voice was calm, but his words cut through the night with quiet strength. "You say you will open your platform for us," he said, "but promises like that have been made before. People promise change, then forget when the lights go off. How do we know you will not forget us tomorrow?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting the same fear. Joe felt their doubt like a weight pressing harder than ever. He realized this was not anger anymore. This was something deeper. It was the ache of people who had been let down too many times to trust easily. Joe's chest tightened. He wanted to shout that he meant it, that he was different. But he knew empty words would only make things worse. He looked at Keanu Reeves, who stood silently beside him, his calm presence anchoring the moment. Keanu's eyes met Joe's, and without speaking, he gave him the answer. Prove it now, not later. Joe swallowed hard, his heart pounding, and then he reached for the microphone that had been set up earlier. "You ask how you can know I will not forget," Joe said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "The truth is, you cannot just take my word for it, so I will not ask you to. Instead, I will start here, tonight. If you are willing, I will let one of you speak now. Your voice will not wait for tomorrow. It will begin today." His words sent a ripple through the crowd. Shock flickered across faces. Some gasped, others leaned closer, unsure if he truly meant it. The man who had questioned him stood still, his expression unreadable. But the woman from earlier, the one who had spoken of losing everything, stepped forward again. Her hands shook as she looked at Joe, as if she wasn't sure she could carry the weight of speaking for so many. Joe offered her the microphone with steady hands, his eyes gentle, his voice soft. "Your story matters," he said. "If you want to share it, the world is ready to listen." The crowd fell silent as the woman took the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but then it grew stronger. She spoke of nights without food, of watching her children cry and feeling powerless, of working endlessly yet still falling short. Every word cracked open the pain she carried, and every sentence made the crowd lean in closer, their eyes wet, their hearts breaking with hers. Joe felt tears burn his own eyes. This was no longer just a gathering. This was truth, raw and unfiltered, flowing into the night for everyone to hear. Keanu stood silently, his face calm, but his eyes shining with unspoken respect. When the woman finished, the crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with applause filled with compassion. Some cried openly, some hugged strangers beside them, some whispered words of encouragement. The woman handed the microphone back to Joe, her hands still shaking, but her face carried something new, dignity. She had been heard. She had been seen. Joe's throat tightened as he spoke again. "This is what I meant," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Your stories are powerful. They are not small. They are not meaningless. They deserve to be heard, and they will be. This is my promise, and tonight you have seen the first step." His words no longer felt like promises. They felt like truth, proven by action. But just as the atmosphere softened, another twist came. A voice shouted from the back, harsh and bitter. "Words, stories, feelings. They won't change the system. They won't fix the real problems. Are you ready to stand against those in power, or will you just hide behind sympathy?" The crowd froze. The question cut deeper than the others before. It was not about honesty anymore. It was about courage against forces larger than them all. Joe felt his chest tighten again, because this was not just about giving people a platform. It was about risking everything. He glanced at Keanu. The Calm in Keanu's face didn't fade, but Joe could see something sharper in his eyes this time. Resolve. Keanu leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper, meant only for Joe. "This is the path," he said. "Words have begun, action has started, but sacrifice will decide everything. Are you ready to pay that price?" Joe's heart pounded. He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew the next step would demand more than words, more than promises. It would demand courage in the face of those who could crush him. And the crowd waited, breathless, to see if he was willing to walk that road. The final stand, the air around the studio grew colder as the bitter question hung in the night. Are you ready to stand against those in power? Or will you just hide behind sympathy? The crowd waited, holding their breath. Joe Rogan felt the weight of the world pressing into his chest. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything. Until now, his journey had been about words, promises, and small steps. But now, the demand was clear. Would he risk his own comfort, his own safety, to fight for something larger than himself? Or would he step back, letting fear take control once again? Joe's mind raced. He thought about the countless times he had sat across from guests, asking bold questions. He had built his life on curiosity and courage. But this was not curiosity anymore. This was sacrifice. He thought about the people in front of him, the woman who had spoken of her suffering, the young man who had asked how to keep going, the faces filled with pain and hope. Their lives were not theories. They were not topics of discussion. They were real, and they needed more than just words. Joe's hands trembled, but in his heart, a decision was forming. Keanu Reeves stood silently beside him, his calm presence stronger than ever. Joe turned to him, searching his eyes for guidance. One last time. Keanu did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at Joe with the quiet strength of someone who had already faced his own storms and survived. "The question is not what you will lose," Keanu said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "but what you are willing to give. Once you choose, there is no turning back." Joe closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, and when he opened them again, the fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He stepped forward, raising his voice so the entire crowd could hear. "I cannot fix everything," Joe said, his voice steady and raw. "I cannot promise to win against every system that has failed you, but I can promise this: I will not stay silent. I will not hide. If standing with you means risking everything I have built, then so be it. Because silence helps the powerful, but truth belongs to the people. I will use my platform, my voice, and whatever strength I have, not for myself, but for us." The crowd erupted, not with chaos, but with a roar of unity. Cheers, claps, and cries blended together, filling the night with a sound that felt alive. Strangers embraced each other, hands reached into the air, and for the first time, the fear that had weighed on them all seemed lighter. Joe felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness, but from a deep realization. This was not his fight alone. It was theirs, together. The man who had shouted the harsh question before lowered his head. His expression softened, no longer filled with anger, but with respect. The woman who had shared her story smiled through her tears, her face glowing with dignity. The young man from earlier stood taller, as if hope had finally found him again. Joe looked at them and felt his chest swell with both pride and humility. He had not given them answers, but he had given them honesty, and that honesty had lit a fire. Keanu stepped forward, his calm voice rising above the noise. "Remember this moment," he said. "It is not about one man or two. It is about all of you standing together, refusing to bow to fear. Change does not come from heroes. It comes from people who refuse to stop trying." His words sank deep into the crowd, their power magnified by the truth they carried. Joe looked at Keanu, gratitude filling his heart. Without Keanu's quiet strength, he might have broken under the weight of doubt. But standing beside him, Joe had discovered a courage he didn't know he had. Tonight had changed everything. He was no longer just a man with a microphone. He was a man who had chosen to stand, to risk, to give. And in that choice, he had found the strength to lead not with power, but with humility. The night ended not with silence, but with voices united in hope. The crowd did not disperse quickly. They lingered, talking to each other, sharing stories, lifting one another. Something new had been born among them, something fragile but real. Joe watched them, his heart heavy but strong. He knew the road. Ahead would be filled with challenges, with opposition, with sacrifices he had yet to face. But he also knew he would not walk it alone. Keanu placed a hand on Joe's shoulder one last time that night. "Everything changed because you chose to stand," he said softly. Joe nodded, his voice breaking as he replied, "No, everything changed because we stood together." And with that, the night closed. Not as an ending, but as the beginning of a journey that would echo far beyond the walls of the studio.